today. This is really incredible to be sort of in the middle of this plaza, taking in all of the various things that are happening. And I just love also that anybody who's walking by can join us, that there's no need to swipe any card or get any bag inspected to be part of this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. I just want to introduce myself. I'm the editorial producer for Eyebeam. And for those of you who don't know, Eyebeam is a 20-year-old New York-based organization that aims to ensure that artists become central in the invention and design of our shared future. And it's been around since 1998. And the organization's residency program has been an invaluable place to think creatively about how technology is transforming society. But I also want to say that I have a very close relationship to Creative Time, a place that I worked for 6 years developing a project where artists reported on the news around the world, which is how I got to meet Ingrid Burrington, who's one of our fellow panelists. And that project really fits in well in terms of what we will be talking about today, which is called The New Story, Creative Practices in Journalism. But I also like this idea of titling this talk, The Story of the Future, because I think we're in a moment right now where we need to kind of think about what the future of stories look like, because currently we're in a bit of a crisis moment, which I'm sure all of you, no matter what country you hail from, feel is happening, despite whether or not your president is an autocrat or not. We are in a moment where we don't quite know what to believe because we're so inundated with images, many of which are created quickly and dispel truths or uplift truths. And so this conversation is really about how do we see the future of practices, artistic practices, that incorporate journalism, and how journalism and journalists incorporate artistic practices. So my first panelist that I want to introduce is Serena Danna, right here to my right. Serena is the managing editor for the Italian edition of Vanity Fair, where she leads the digital development of the magazine. Previously, she worked for Corriere della Sera, where she co-founded the literary supplement La Lettura and the gender and identity newsletter Futura. In 2011, she wrote the book Prodotto Interno Mafia. Some of her incredible work, which is why she's on the stage right now, has incorporated data visualization techniques. Such topics have included, the evolution of global religions, for instance. And so, with that, we move on to our next panelist, somebody who I've worked with for, I think, almost 5 years now. She was a contributor to Creative Time Reports, and because I love the way she describes herself on her website, I'm completely lifting it and using it. So she writes, makes maps, and tells jokes about places, politics, and the weird feelings people have about both. Also sometimes magic, which we can get into a little bit later. Some of her wonderful stories that she's written very recently have been, Could Facebook be tried for human rights abuses? And Who Controls the Internet? Ted Cruz's fantasy versus reality. So I think there's a lot of wonderful, rich stuff we're going to dig into in the topic today. Surya, unfortunately, could not be with us because of some visa issues, but I still want to reference his bio because Ingrid and Surya are part of a residency program at Eyebeam right now that is supported by the Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and it's addressing the future of journalism. It was launched in partnership with the Brown Institute at Columbia, and I want to thank them for their support of the project. So Surya is an artist, engineer, and journalist based in Brooklyn. He's a data researcher and reporter at Gizmodo's Special Projects Desk. He's a research scientist at the Center for Civic Media at the MIT Lab. And previously he was a contributing reporter at ProPublica, where he was working on Machine Bias, a series that aims to highlight how algorithmic systems can be biased and discriminate against people, and he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for this project. So Surya and Ingrid have been working collectively as Infra, Investigations, Near Futures, Research, and Art, a loosely associated organized organization and detective agency, which I want very much to hear more about as we talk. So, because we don't have any visuals here, I think it's really important that we take a moment and hear each of our panelists talk a bit about their projects and how they relate to the subject of this talk. And that way we can sort of like form the basis for what this conversation will be about. Okay, Serena, do you want to go first?
So thank you very much. Thank you for being here. So as I just moved to Vanity Fair, probably, you know, it could be more interesting if we talk a little bit about my experience at La Lectura, because I think that it could be also a good example for what does it mean to put together, you know, media politics and journalism right now. So when Corriere della Sera, it's probably the oldest Italian newspaper. It has 155 years, and it's pretty much conservative, so, you know, don't figure out like, you know, an innovation newspaper, because that's not. But when they decided to launch the new cultural supplement called La Lectura, so we focus a lot about how to include the most contemporary forms and issues about culture, because of course culture is, you know, tradition, is history, but there are a lot of, you know, new issues that we should include. And so basically we decide to focus on information design, and we launched this very important part of the magazine called Visual Data. And you know, it was great because actually the visual data section became an app for young designers to, you know, apply their talent in a very old-style news environment. So the incredible thing was that, you know, that was an Italian newspaper, an Italian supplement, written in Italian, no distribution, you know, abroad, no website, but it became really important. I mean, it became like, you know, a landmark for international designers. And, you know, one of the most important artists that probably you know, Giorgia Lupi, did, you know, the founder of Accurate Studio, did their first steps there. And, you know, also, I don't know, I can mention Samuel Granados, who used to run the Washington Post department of data visualization, you know, worked with that. So, you know, it was really interesting because I think that, you know, I had the chance to be a kind of bridge between the old world of journalism and this new world of young, talented designers that, you know, the majority of them never had, you know, any experience with journalism. And so I must confess that the beginning was really tough because, you know, there were no communication at all between the two worlds. So my mantra actually became like new media, old values. So my goals became how, you know, may I convince, you know, how may we emancipate by like pie charts without losing that, you know, that immediacy, that simplicity, that it's really important when you work with readers, you know, because our focus are readers, are not like artists or designers. First of all, they are readers. So it was really difficult to make understand artists that they have, you know, they could experiment, but without losing that simplicity, that clarity, and also all the old values that, you know, are really important for journalism. And because, you know, I remember that at the beginning we did this incredible, beautiful with data visualization, but, you know, actually if you brought that kind of data visualization with, you know, one reader in person, actually they could understand like nothing. So the comment was like, oh, that's wonderful artwork. And I was like, I don't want to do artwork, I want to do journalism. So let's try to understand how these two words can connect together to make like great journalism. And well, I think that, I don't know if we reached that goal, but of course, in 6 years, I could say that probably, that this makes this relationship became much more simple. And well, and I'm sure that, we could do more in the next month and years to make this relationship, simpler and effective for readers.
So I just want to hear from you, Ingrid, a little bit about your practice pre this current residency, and then if you can, talk a little bit about infra and the work that you've been doing.
Sure. Thanks so much for all coming. Thanks to Creative Time for having us, and to the Brown Institute for buying me a plane ticket. So Surya and I have kind of separate practices and have collaborated a bit since 2015, I want to say, and both kind of had been interested in communicating kind of the deeper complexities of network systems and living with them. So my work had primarily focused on kind of material infrastructure of the internet, all of the stuff that makes computers work that generally doesn't get seen by people because it's in like a data center in the middle of nowhere, or it's buried underground or something.
Wait, I have to interrupt. I'm so sorry, because actually this is...
Do a visual.
This is a visual. This is Ingrid's book, The Networks of New York, which is a field guide for people to walk around New York City and actually see the internet, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And it's really, really beautiful, and it's pocket size, actually. So I recommend it.
It's a pretty big pocket. But,
a big pocket, indeed. Yes, a large pocket.
The first edition, which was like a self-published artist book, was a little bit narrower. But it's I've sometimes seen it in bookstores in the New York tourism section, so which I feel like is, if you're like a really niche tourist, it's like super fun. But and so that's sort of the kind of work I'd been doing. And Surya had been doing a lot of work around spectrum and basically like wireless communications and how deeply insecure they were, and how kind of like they're this sort of ubiquitous information landscape that was very hard to see because it's literally imperceptible to the human eye, surrounded and like kind of was informing the way that we lived. And so we've been doing work mainly kind of like as educators in that space, and both kind of accidentally fell into journalism from kind of different paths. And I think that getting an education in art and becoming an artist is like mostly learning how to improvise and be kind of a mercenary. So you use whatever means necessary to kind of get the work across and get the idea and point across. And it turns out in a time where like all kind of like cultural outputs are collapsed into content, whether they're art or journalism or something else, like it kind of makes a lot of sense to move between the two fields. So I think that one of the things that's really fun about working with Surya, and one of the things we really like doing, is kind of realizing we don't necessarily have to like we can kind of like move between different conventions. So like we did this kind of complex research-driven like sound art installation at Eyebeam last month for like a one-night event, and that was one way to do like a kind of investigative story about like Amazon supply chain. It's, there's lots of news stories about that. That was just a different way to kind of approach that story. A project we're working on right now around basically like the ways in which like tech platforms, like particularly we've mostly focused on Facebook because they're like demonstrably the worst one, have the ways in which these companies can kind of like get around kind of like obeying the law, or like kind of can reconstruct the laws through creating loopholes for themselves in their own terms of service, and kind of looking at how the evolution of these documents kind of makes companies into what they are. And the ways we're telling that story are like through like annotated like artist books, but also like interventions into like the ways that people can like use the platform. And I think one of the things like that has been kind of interesting about this residency is that we're not having to answer to like an editor who's going to say like that's a bad idea, like, or like, is that a journalism? Because like it doesn't really fucking matter.
Well, I'll switch. Okay. I think that's actually a great segue into the current moment that we're in. This idea about, well, does it even fucking matter? Well, how about, we don't actually know quite what matters these days. I think we're all sort of on shaky ground. And it's a moment where all of the information networks that we've relied on are failing us, right? So Facebook and Twitter are just jammed with bots, and then we have news, which we don't quite know whether it's actually news or it's going to be interpreted as partisan. And so all of these systems seem to be kind of a mess. And I think people are looking at themselves, sort of respectively in the journalism and the art world, to see how exactly we can approach this moment. And so I'm really curious about how you two think about the stories and the projects that you work on. Because this moment is in flux in a way I don't think we've ever seen in our lifetimes, how are you inspired to work? Do you feel the demands of the moment changing the course of your work? Or do you see yourself kind of resisting buying into the speed in which we are being forced to process information and then move on? So I'm really curious about this era and how you're inspired to focus on certain projects. So each of you can talk specifically about a project, or you can talk more generally about it. It would be great to.
Well, that's a big question. But I want to tell you a story first, but probably it could be useful also for this discussion. Okay, as you probably know, Italy has a new government. And, well, it's not the best government we were expecting. It's a kind of, right, it's a weird mix between right and not left, but kind of populist, and well, it's a very bad moment for my country because, actually we thought that we could be out from this wave of right populistic, movements that basically are winning pretty much all the westward. But anyway, so, well, we tried, Vanity Fair is, the good thing about Vanity Fair is that you can write about different things. So in Italy, Vanity Fair is pretty much similar to the American one. So we have a lot of politics and, great stories. So since the new government was elected, we started to write, to be a little bit strong about the criticism. Well, but I think in a very, honest way, not like with prejudice or stereotype. But anyway, and we were attacked a lot on our Facebook page. And so yesterday, after that, we published a profile of, well, probably you have heard about this Aquarius boat thing, that actually Italy rejected a boat with 600, 700 migrants on. And, the new minister, Matteo Salvini, said, okay, you decide to close the ports. So the boat had to move to Valencia because on the contrary, Spain said, okay, we can welcome these migrants and refugees. But anyway, we profiled that story on our website, and the reaction was that we were basically attacked by, hundreds of comments of people that say, just focus on fashion, just focus on, I don't know, nails, and don't talk about this stuff. But the interesting thing about that is that my colleagues got in panic. So yesterday, basically, they came to me and they say, what should we do? Because probably, are we getting wrong? Are we going too much into this stuff? So that's really interesting because coming back to your question, even if you are pretty sure that, you're doing a good job, this moment I think that, is affecting our way of working in a very broad and deep way. And I'm sure that, we should create probably more, curated networks of readers. If I think, I'm focusing a lot about that because I think that the problem is that in the last few years, probably we focus too much on, I think that we as a journalist have a great responsibility in that because as we know, on the internet, the only economy that works is the economy of attention. So probably, we were too much focused on sensationalism and clickbaiting stuff, and in this work to try always to catch the attention of readers, probably we did a lot of mistakes. So right now, I'm working about how we can focus better on our stories and trying to, rebuild the trust of readers. Because of course we had the problem of trust that became a lot of years ago. And I don't know if I have time to, okay. But, because we were discussing, I don't know if you guys remember about that, but I'm old enough to remember a movement called Indymedia. I don't know if you remember. No? Okay. Okay, Indymedia basically was a publishing network of independent journalists that was born during the 1999 protests in Seattle against the WTO. And basically their idea was that, that was when became the struggle in trusting media. So that one when became a kind of revolution against traditional media, because probably what you see on corporation media is not, entirely the truth. And their slogan was, don't hate the media, be the media. So basically they were trying to build, a new kind of consciousness about what does it mean, to be a journalist. What does it mean, journalism? And that was 1999. And I think that, in these 20 years, instead of focus on this big demand of, criticism and say, okay, let's see if, people don't trust anymore New York Times, but just because it's New York Times or Corriere della Sera. People start to have doubts about that. And instead of focus on this, I think that the majority of news outlets, start to focus on how to get the attention of readers in a very quickly way. And so the problem is that now, if at the beginning the slogan was, don't hate the media, be the media, unfortunately I think that now is hate the media, So, well, I'm very worried about this moment, but I'm pretty sure that, we can find together as journalists, artists, and designers new and more effective ways of, also break this attention economy and trying to show that there are new ways to engage people, even if, they are very destructive because they can go everywhere, they can read a lot of stuff, and, when false and true, and probably artists and designers can help us to find a more engaging way to tell our stories, our deep stories. But first of all, I think that we as a journalist should start to focus again on, making just a great work to become, trustful for readers again.
Ingrid, how much do you feel like your practice needs to be responding to these kinds of moments, these unceasing media moments that we're enduring?
I find it, on the one hand, I think like responding to like present crises is like a very necessary thing, and there's a lot of like frankly like triage-based reporting and kind of like harm reduction level work that needs to happen. I think at the same time, I worry that the urge to kind of like rush head on into kind of like one angle or one like piece or into just the entire kind of morass of it, like just perpetuates a lot of the problems that got us into this mess, right? I've been, seen a lot of journalists who were covering very different beats or who had very different kind of like, subject matter that they were reporting on, being like, well, I guess I'm just gonna like read Reddit all day and like tell people what Nazis think now. And like, aside from the fact that that's just like shitty journalism, like that's like, oh, look, behold, Nazis think things. Like there's no power analysis, there's no ramifications, it's kind of just like smell this journalism. It's also just like, it's to the discredit of all of these other, like, the millions of other kind of like really urgent things that happen simultaneously. I worry about, on the one hand, like no one can look at the whole thing at once. On the other hand, like it's to kind of just point at kind of like the worst piece of the trash fire, like kind of ignores the fact that some other part of the trash fire is like giving off toxic fumes that's probably going to give you cancer and is also not good. And that's like a really sad metaphor. As I said it, I just realized. One thing I just wanted to also kind of comment on your point about the like Indymedia slogan and what's kind of come instead. I feel like the moment we're in is not maybe just hate the media, it's hate and be the media, because I think nobody seemed to realize when they were creating these indie networks and like blogging and like getting outside of the mainstream that it was entirely possible that like fascists could get in on the act too. Like the trajectory from like Indymedia to InfoWars, obviously they have very different agendas, and one of them sells vitamins. But it's like I feel like Alex Jones probably kind of thinks of himself as like, I just was like a startup getting outside of this like bad corporate hegemony. I think the idea that like they're, on the one hand it's great, you can do your own thing, and it creates like wonderful new kind of forms. But to be like naive as to think like, like only good people who want nice things for everyone will leverage these tools, I think is like a fiction that really hasn't worked since like at least 2011.
Even because you never, could you ever go to a citizen dentist? I think never, and so probably as you never could go to a citizen dentist, you should trust that probably also journalists did something to become journalists.
Yeah, no, I love that actually. It's that, and also turning the work that journalists do into it's now content. And what does content mean? It's like a word that's thrown around a lot, and it kind of undercuts what it means to write, to research, to report. It's now content, and everybody's looking for it, and it's there to fill a page or to support a brand, and it's lost something in the process a little bit. That's a tiny sidetrack. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between art and newspapers, and I'm just going to say very personally that at Creative Time Reports, which partnered with major publications including The Guardian and Foreign Policy and Al Jazeera. One of the things that we struggled with was this idea that art belongs on the art part of the paper, so a few sections back from the front. Or I was often asked to come up with illustrations for texts, right? And so this idea of like getting art inside a newspaper, especially a newspaper like the one that you worked with that's 150 years old, it's a challenge. It's a challenge even for the most culturally curious of editors to hear the word art and think, okay, you can be on A1, the front page of the newspaper. It's just was my experience. And yet, the artists that we worked with over the years had an incredible way of looking at the world that, in my opinion, deserved the kind of attention that many journalists were getting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about both of your experiences. I mean, especially you, Ingrid, you are an artist and a writer and all these other things, but first and foremost, you're an artist. How do you negotiate that when it comes to establishing relationships with editors? And that's the kind of thing I'm really interested in. If we're going to move forward, if we're going to have this hybridized kind of practice where art and journalism are working together to craft a new story, well, how do we get the editors who hold a lot of the power to understand the importance of this next kind of story that we're creating?
I feel like this isn't a great answer, but it's like the work. Like that's how you convince people. And unfortunately, like that assumes you can front load the work, or like you have like already done certain things that can like be brought forward as like good arguments. I think the other thing that's convenient about artist as a title is that nobody seems to know what that means, or there's like a slipperiness to it that means that I can kind of like go between different places, and it gives a certain, like, it's like a little bit of like weird deniability, and I mean, I find like I don't, when I'm doing something that's kind of more just like straight reported journalism, I don't worry too much about it. Like I just kind of do the work. But I think ultimately, I think it's like example that kind of helps, and some of it's the like the precedents that kind of have been set. I don't know if that was a helpful.
And obviously, you have a very different perspective being on the other side of it. But I mean, I'm really curious to hear about the challenges that you had to face with such a traditional publication, trying to introduce a very exquisite kind of visualization of data. Like, what were some of the challenges, and how do we think about it moving forward too?
Well, as I said at the beginning, it was really tough because I had to make like a bridge between these two words, and basically, you had the newsroom part that was really skeptical with the designers because, well, that was the case in which they thought that it was hard, it was design, so, and so it was really difficult trying to, convince the newsroom that, we could trust them and, we should use them to make great journalists. On the other side, probably, I don't know what you think, but of course now you reach a level in which you are a journalist. I don't know what you are, but you do great stories, great journalistic stories. So, but probably at the beginning, I don't know what's your idea about, but my first challenge was that they felt really free. I think that the freedom was the creative freedom, was probably the most important thing that they thought to have. And so for me it was really bad to be the one that had to make always like limits, boundaries to their freedom. And in this, in this relationship between, in this negotiation between my values, like journalistic limits and their freedom, probably, that was the key for our job together. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think like collaboration with editors is mostly just like me being like, don't tell me what to do, and then realizing you are entirely correct, and I should probably it's part of the job. One of the things, I don't know, that just made me think about also is like after like, you know, the like 1970s, like what got to be journalism also like changed a lot. I'm mostly just thinking about like since Tom Wolfe recently died, that sort of conversation about like new journalism, which like was really just like literary writing that had a fancier name. I think that in some ways like also artists have like kind of been able to like benefit from the latitude that that kind of legacy of that particular kind of journalism has afforded people. But yeah, I feel like for a long time I kind of thought, art doesn't have a standardized like kind of like system of ethics and like facts. I mean, like ethics is like a cool conversation you can have in art. It's like not something that you like are held to in the same way most of the time. So it's like, journalism, clearly the nobler pursuit and industry. Then I did journalism for a few years and learned that actually like both sides are deeply fraught, and like just because you have sort of ethics you adhere to, those aren't necessarily always ethics you agree with. There are always ethics that like work out well for everybody. Yeah, that answer didn't go where I thought it was going to go. So, but yeah.
So I just want to just address one more thing before we open it up for questions, which is, Ingrid, what you were just discussing, this sort of the new journalism moment. Do you guys think we're there? Is there any way to define what this moment looks like? Are we just too in the weeds to actually think about it? I mean, has it changed? Will it change? And how do you think the hybridized practice of art and journalism will potentially affect the next stage that we're entering?
So in terms of is something new happening or is it that different, like this is very embarrassing to admit, but I think for me a lot of like the way I approach the work I'm making is I'm like I think about like some of my areas of interest. I'm like, this is shit that like Robert Smithson would be into if he were alive. Like that dude would be obsessed with data centers, right? And I think like that particular kind of like semi-psychotic architectural criticism writing thing was like its own kind of weird journalistic commentary. So it's not new. It's like, and artists have been doing it. They just were like maybe doing it in art form, or they were doing it in like a slightly different vernacular. I think what I worry about, and I think is like not that new, but like is changing rapidly, is that like content collapsing of material, in the sense that like when I said like it doesn't really matter, it's like it doesn't matter what you call it, but it does matter if it's true, and it does matter if it's honest about its intentions, and it does matter like who's like kind of like which like vectors of power it's like approaching, or which powers vector it's kind of like serving. And I think the harder part of this kind of collapsing of media is the challenge of discerning what these different things are, and being able to like accurately critique and have a conversation about what they are. We were talking earlier about the fact that like a few months ago when that New Yorker fiction story Cat Person came out, I saw people referring to it as an essay, as an article, as investigative reporting, and I'm like, none of these words mean anything anymore. It was literally a made-up story. And that that's kind of like where it's like there's some more like all of this just becomes made-up stories.
Serena.
Well,
On the front lines. Yes.
okay. Well, probably you mentioned that the project that I run at Corriere della Sera, the newsletter Futura, okay? So, actually that was my front line for this kind of topic, because we thought that we should start, it was like 3 years ago maybe, that probably we should start to talk about like private things and stuff that people really feel. And well, Italy is really different from the United States as landscape. So of course for you as Americans it's pretty familiar to, you had such a big boom of personal essays. It's kind of probably 10 years trend in the United States. But in Italy it was pretty recent. And so when we started to work on that, and so how can we as a journalist can talk about private issues can talk about gender, but not in a public way, but in a really private, fragile, personal way. You know, it was really interesting for me because I knew just one thing, that I didn't want that, you know, Corriere della Sera could become like personal diaries, because I think that the problem, you know, with this kind of topics is that suddenly you start to see on the newspaper, like, I don't know, the problem with my hair and the problem with, you know. So how can we, you know, manage this stuff in a way that, you know, can affect not just, you know, the friends and the family of the people that is writing, but all the people that are reading, and that in a way can relate it with such an issue. And so that was a kind of dream for me. And so probably the way at the end was that if you choose an issue that, you know, it could be a really, you know, small issue, but very important to a lot of people. So probably that's the way to, you know, manage also like important personal private issues, but in a way that it's not felt like, you know, personal affairs or, you know, literary stuff, but in a way that, you know, could really engage more readers in an effective way. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue in one or two sentences, and this is not dissimilar to what we just discussed, but in a way, I'd love to just like put on our goggles and look into the future, and if you could say in a couple sentences, what is the most sort of radical way you think that news will be reported or read or seen in 20 years from now? Just like, I know it's a kind of crazy question, but in a way, you know, it can go in a million different directions, but I'm really curious, like, are we going to have to put on, you know, is it going to be VR goggles, and that's how we experience news, by actually walking into the surroundings that are being reported on, or is it pretty much more of the same? I'm really curious in just a couple sentences what you guys think this may look like in, you know, decade, 2 decades from now.
I think it's pretty bold to think we might have a few decades ahead of us.
Well, I would be more optimistic, but I'm not. I really think that we should work on readers, you know. I don't know what kind of forms and, you know, tools, but I'm sure that we have to work a lot on, you know, rebuild the relationship with readers, to create like feel space for readers, to be, you know, to be again a landmark for make people say that, you know, they are in a safe place where they can learn, where they can debate, where they can, you know, share their information, and well, and I hope that we will get that point.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Really, really appreciate. Thank you, Creative Time, to the Brown Institute and Eyebeam for having us. And check out Eyebeam's residency and the work of Ingrid and Mazria. There's a lot to come out of their time this year at the organization. Thank you.